The dark story of the world's most famous bridge, Golden Gate Bridge. The fog rolls in like a shroud, thick and silent, swallowing the twin towers that peer 746 feet into the California sky. Below, the Pacific churns dark and cold, 220 feet down, a fall that takes exactly 4 seconds. The international orange paint, chosen not for beauty but for visibility in the mist, glows like a warning. Rust blooms in hidden crevices despite constant maintenance, as salt water eats at the steel, molecule by molecule. The cables hum in the wind, a sound witnesses describe as somewhere between singing and screaming. Since opening day in 1937, over 2 billion vehicles have crossed this 1.7-mile span, but there's another number the bridge keeps, one etched into police reports, Coast Guard logs, and family obituaries. The Golden Gate isn't just an engineering marvel that defied the impossible. It's a monument where human ambition and human despair converge in ways its builders never intended. Is this bridge a symbol of hope connecting two shores, or a threshold between life and something else entirely? If you're fascinated by the hidden stories, dark secrets, and uncomfortable truths behind the world's most famous buildings, like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss any. Tell me in the comments, which building or iconic structure should I uncover next? Your support makes these in-depth investigations possible. Thank you for being here. Now, let's begin. No one believed it could be done, and they had mathematics on their side. The Golden Gate Strait was, by every engineering calculation of the 1920s, unbridgeable. The water ran 372 feet deep at its center, with currents that could reach 7 knots, faster than most swimmers could hope to fight. Fierce Pacific winds howled through the gap at speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour. And the fog that San Francisco made famous reduced visibility to arm's length for 1,017 hours every year. Earthquakes had leveled the city before, and would again. The strait was also a vital shipping channel, meaning any bridge would need clearance for the tallest vessels of the age, while somehow anchoring in conditions that seemed designed by nature to prevent exactly such ambition. Joseph Strauss stood barely 5 feet tall, a man whose physical stature matched neither his engineering reputation nor his monumental ego. He'd built hundreds of drawbridges across America's rivers, functional, forgettable structures that raised and lowered on command. Nothing in his portfolio suggested he could conquer the Golden Gate. His initial design, submitted in 1921, was so ungainly that critics called it an upside-down rat trap, a hybrid cantilever suspension design that looked like engineering indecision made steel. San Francisco's establishment dismissed him as a bridge builder trying to play with the ocean. Yet, Strauss possessed something more valuable than credentials. He was a relentless political operator who understood that impossible projects aren't defeated by nature, but by bureaucracy and money. For 7 years, he fought through 2,300 lawsuits from ferry operators who saw financial ruin in every proposal. He convinced counties from San Francisco to Del Norte to form a special district with bonding authority. When the Great Depression hit in 1929 and private financing evaporated, Strauss did the unthinkable. He mortgaged the bridge that didn't exist yet, convincing Bank of America to back $35 million in bonds against the toll revenue of an imaginary structure. The mathematics, though, remained unchanged. Engineers told Strauss that winds would twist his roadway into scrap, that tides would undermine any foundation, that the fog itself would conceal construction accidents until bodies washed ashore. The U.S. Navy insisted that any falling construction debris would create shipping hazards for a generation. Seismologists pointed to the San Andreas Fault, running like a scar just miles away, and asked what would happen when, not if, the Earth moved. Strauss knew he was outmatched technically, so he did what insecure men with grand visions often do. He hired people smarter than himself, then claimed their innovations as his own. Leon Moisseiff, the engineer behind Manhattan Bridge, would design the suspension system. Charles Ellis, a mathematician who spoke fluent Greek and quoted Homer, would perform the calculations that made the impossible merely improbable. Irving Morrow, an architect, would transform function into beauty. Strauss would get his name carved in stone. Was Strauss a visionary who assembled genius to overcome nature's obstacles, or a credit-stealing politician who happened to be standing nearby when brilliant minds did the actual work? Building the South Tower meant constructing an underwater prison for human beings. The South Pier had to be sunk in 110 feet of turbulent water, through mud and rock, to reach bedrock strong enough to hold 44,000 tons of tower. The solution was a cofferdam, essentially a massive watertight box that would be towed into position, then sunk and sealed, creating a dry working chamber on the ocean floor. Inside this chamber, men would excavate in shifts, breathing compressed air and working in claustrophobic darkness, while the Pacific pressed against steel walls with the weight of catastrophe. On the morning of January 5, 1933, workers towed the cofferdam into position against a tide so strong it required 3 tugboats straining at full power. As they attempted to anchor it, a channel fog descended with the speed of a dropped curtain, reducing visibility to 0. Somewhere in that whiteness, a cargo ship, the Sidney M. Hauptmann, bound for Portland with lumber, emerged like a ghost made of steel. The ship's captain never saw the cofferdam. The impact tore a 40-foot gash in the structure, and the Pacific poured in with a sound witnesses compared to artillery fire. 12 men were inside when the water hit. The compressed air that kept the chamber dry suddenly had an escape route, and the resulting decompression, going from high pressure to sea level pressure in seconds, is what deep-sea divers call the bends. Nitrogen bubbles formed in the workers' bloodstreams, causing joint pain so severe that grown men sobbed. One man, a riveter named Chris Anderson, described feeling his bones trying to push out through his skin. The evacuation was chaos, men climbing ladders in rising water, some falling back into the flood, others pulled up by colleagues who held wrists even as their own lungs screamed for air. All 12 survived, though 3 would suffer joint damage for the rest of their lives. The cofferdam itself sank in 40 feet of water, representing $250,000 in wasted materials and months of lost time. Joseph Strauss held a press conference 3 days later, stating that temporary setbacks are the price of permanent achievement, a quote that would ring hollow to those who permanently limped. The second attempt involved building a fender, a protective barrier of timber and steel around the entire worksite. This fender, costing an additional $350,000, was built with wood from old-growth redwoods, trees that had stood for 500 years before being felled to protect workers for 5 months. The environmental cost was never calculated, because in 1933, no one was counting trees against human progress. Inside the reconstructed cofferdam, conditions were medieval. Men worked in teams of 30, descending via a narrow shaft to a chamber that never saw daylight. The compressed air necessary to keep water out also caused nitrogen narcosis, a condition that impairs judgment, slows reaction time, and creates a sense of euphoria exactly when clarity is most needed. 4 men watched for signs: slurred speech, giggling, workers staring at nothing. One man, Harold McLean, had to be restrained after trying to remove his air hose, convinced he could breathe water. He spent 2 weeks in a hospital under observation. The excavation produced 3,000 cubic yards of mud and rock that had to be hauled up bucket by bucket through the access shaft. The work proceeded in 6-hour shifts because longer exposure to compressed air increased the risk of embolism, air bubbles in the bloodstream that could cause stroke, paralysis, or death. Coming up too quickly could kill. Staying down too long could kill. The narrow margin between safety and catastrophe was measured in minutes and atmospheric pressure units that most workers couldn't calculate or comprehend. Was the cofferdam disaster an acceptable construction risk that proves the bridge's eventual success, or an early warning of the human costs that would define the bridge's entire existence? Charles Ellis did the mathematics that made the Golden Gate possible,
then was erased from its history while the bridge was still being built. Ellis wasn't a typical engineer. He held a PhD in engineering from the University of Illinois, but spent his nights reading Plato and ancient Greek and translating mathematical theorems into poetry. He joined the Golden Gate Project in 1929 as Strauss's vice president in charge of design, and what he inherited was chaos. Strauss's hybrid cantilever suspension design that looked like a mechanical insect and would have cost $200 million the district didn't have. Working from a small office in Chicago, 3,000 miles from the actual bridge site, Ellis spent 3 years performing calculations that filled 20,000 pages of handwritten analysis. This was before computers, before calculators beyond slide rules. Every stress calculation, every wind load analysis, every determination of how much the cables would stretch under load or contract in cold, all of it done with pencil, paper, and a mathematical mind that could hold multiple variables in suspended animation while solving for the unknown. Ellis revolutionized suspension bridge design by proving that lighter could be stronger. Traditional thinking held that suspension bridges needed massive, rigid roadways to prevent wind damage. Ellis's calculations showed that a flexible roadway, one that could move with the wind rather than resist it, would actually be more stable. His design reduced the bridge's weight by 3,000 tons compared to Strauss's original plan, saving $5 million in materials while increasing its ability to withstand 100-mile-per-hour winds. But Ellis made a fatal mistake. He became so absorbed in the mathematics that he stopped reporting to Strauss with sufficient frequency. In December 1931, with calculations still incomplete, Strauss visited Ellis's Chicago office unannounced and found him buried in papers, working 16-hour days on complex differential equations. Strauss, who barely understood the math Ellis was performing, saw only insubordination, a vice president who spent more time with Greek philosophers than updating his boss. The confrontation was brief. Strauss demanded immediate reports on construction deadlines. Ellis tried to explain that the calculations required absolute precision, that rushing would risk catastrophic failure, that the mathematics couldn't be simplified to fit a project manager's timeline. Strauss fired him on December 14, 1931 via telegram. Ellis's response was a single sentence: "I regret that you feel this way." For the next 5 years, as the bridge rose from blueprints to steel reality, Ellis continued his calculations, unpaid, unacknowledged, working from his home because he knew the structure's survival depended on getting the mathematics right. He completed his stress analyses in 1932, mailed them to the project office, and received no response. When the bridge opened in May 1937, the official program listed Joseph Strauss as chief engineer and mentioned Ellis nowhere. The commemorative plaque installed at the toll plaza bore Strauss's name in letters 3 inches high. Ellis's name was absent. Historical records show that Strauss actively suppressed Ellis's contributions. When the American Civil Engineer Society prepared to award Ellis recognition for his mathematical innovations, Strauss wrote letters claiming that Ellis had merely performed routine calculations under supervision. When engineering journals requested interviews with the design team, Strauss provided a list that omitted Ellis entirely. One historian, John van der Zee, later discovered memos in which Strauss instructed subordinates to clarify Dr. Ellis's limited role whenever questions arose. Ellis never publicly challenged Strauss's credit claiming. He took a teaching position at Purdue University, where colleagues remembered him as quiet, precise, and strangely reluctant to discuss his most significant achievement. Students who asked about the Golden Gate Bridge received the same response: "I did some work on that project once." He died in 1949, 12 years after the bridge opened, without ever seeing his name associated with the structure his mathematics made possible. In 2012, 75 years after opening day, the Golden Gate Bridge Highway and Transportation District finally added Ellis's name to the official roster of principal designers. By then, no one who had worked with him was alive to witness the correction. Was Ellis's erasure an unfortunate political casualty of construction's competitive environment, or a deliberate theft of intellectual legacy by a man whose ego demanded credit for genius he couldn't comprehend? The numbers behind the Golden Gate Bridge quantify ambition transformed into physical reality and the human cost embedded in every measurement. The bridge consumed 83,000 tons of steel, requiring 600,000 rivets driven at temperatures exceeding 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough that dropped rivets would burn through boot leather in seconds. Workers handled these rivets with tongs, catching them in metal buckets after they'd been heated in portable forges suspended on the tower faces. The main cables, each 36.5 inches in diameter, contained 27,572 individual wires that, if stretched end to end, would circle the Earth 3 times at the equator. A total of 80,000 miles of wire manufactured, transported and woven into place by hand. Construction required 389,000 cubic yards of concrete, enough to build a 5-foot-wide sidewalk from San Francisco to New York City. The foundation of the South Tower alone consumed 23,500 cubic yards, the equivalent of 1,840 concrete truckloads in modern terms. 11 men died during construction, a fatality rate of approximately 1 death per $3.1 million stent, though this ratio is meaningless to the families who received $5,000 settlements from a $1,000 life insurance policy required of all workers. The bridge opened with toll revenue projections of $4 million annually. Actual first-year revenue reached $1.3 million, forcing district officials to acknowledge that traffic predictions, like human lives, had been calculated with optimistic assumptions that reality would not honor. They called it the greatest safety innovation in history, until the day it became a tomb for 10 men. Joseph Strauss, perhaps mindful of his own reputation or genuinely concerned with worker safety, motives we can debate but never definitively prove, mandated a massive safety net be installed beneath the entire construction zone. The net, manufactured by the Columbia Net and Twine Company, measured 60 feet wide and stretched 1,700 feet beneath the roadway, suspended 180 feet above the water. It cost $130,000, more than the annual salary of 50 bridge workers combined, but Strauss calculated that saving lives would also save money by reducing insurance premiums, minimizing construction delays from accident investigations, and maintaining worker morale. The net worked spectacularly. During the first 3 years of construction, 19 men fell from various heights, some from scaffolding failures, others from simple loss of balance on narrow beams, one from passing out due to heat exhaustion while working on the roadway deck. The net caught all 19. These men formed an informal club called the Halfway to Hell Club, treating their near-death experiences with the dark humor that construction workers use to metabolize trauma. They held meetings in a San Francisco bar, buying rounds for each new member who'd felt the sickening moment of falling before the net's rope embrace. Foreman noticed that the net had an unintended psychological effect. Some workers became more reckless, taking shortcuts and ignoring safety protocols because they trusted the net to catch them. It's a phenomenon psychologists now call risk compensation, when safety measures paradoxically increase risky behavior because people feel protected. Strauss never addressed this publicly, but internal memos show he was aware that the net might be creating the very dangers it was meant to prevent. On February 17, 1937, just 3 months before the bridge's scheduled opening, a section of scaffolding beneath the roadway gave way. The scaffolding, a temporary platform weighing 12 tons, had been secured with bolts and cables rated to hold twice its weight. What engineers hadn't calculated was the cumulative stress of workers, equipment, and materials concentrated on a platform designed for static load. When one bolt sheared under lateral pressure from wind pushing against the platform's surface area, the stress redistributed instantly to adjacent bolts, creating a cascade failure. The platform fell with 10 men on it. The safety net caught them for approximately 1.8 seconds, long enough for bodies to decelerate from free fall before the platform's weight tore through the rope mesh. The net and the platform fell together, a mass of hemp, steel, and human beings plunging 220 feet into water so cold it causes cardiac arrest in swimmers within 15 minutes. The Coast Guard recovered 8 bodies within hours. Two men, Fred Dummetson and Terence Hallinan, were never found, presumably trapped beneath the platform when it sank in 372 feet of water. Dummetson's wife received a telegram informing her that her husband's body was unrecoverable. No one explained whether that meant lost in the bay or crushed beyond recognition. The investigation revealed that the scaffolding bolts were manufactured to specification, but installed in conditions that specifications hadn't considered: constant vibration from rivet guns, salt air corrosion, and thermal expansion and contraction that loosened connections over months of exposure. In other words, the failure was predictable if anyone had been thinking in geological time rather than construction deadlines. Strauss suspended all work for 1 week, not as a memorial, but to re-inspect every remaining piece of scaffolding. Workers returned to find additional safety cables installed, double the previous number, but the net was never repaired. For the final 3 months of construction, men worked above water with no safety net at all, knowing that one mistake meant certain death. The official death toll for Golden Gate Bridge construction is 11 men. This counts the 10 who died when the net failed, plus Harold Wobber, though Wobber's death is categorized differently in official records because he didn't die during construction. He died after the bridge opened, walking to the center span one August morning and jumping. Wobber was a World War I veteran who had worked as a bargeman in the bay, and who told a friend just before he climbed the railing, "This is where I get off." Wobber's death is often cited as the first Golden Gate Bridge suicide, beginning a grim tradition that has continued for nearly 90 years. But what's rarely mentioned is that Wobber knew the bridge intimately. He'd worked in the waters beneath it, seen the construction, understood exactly how far the fall was and what waited below. His decision to die there suggests that the bridge had become, even in its first months, something more than infrastructure. Was the safety net's failure a tragic accident, exposing the limits of 1930s engineering, or evidence that the bridge's very construction was proceeding too fast, with too much confidence in devices that couldn't possibly save everyone?
The bridge's signature color wasn't chosen for beauty. It was chosen because it made the bridge visible in fog, like painting a warning sign across the Pacific entrance. Before construction began, the U.S. Navy proposed that the bridge be painted in candy stripes, alternating yellow and black bands that would maximize visibility for ships navigating the strait in low visibility conditions. Navy officials, whose authority over navigable waters gave them significant input, argued that the Golden Gate was first and foremost a shipping channel, and any bridge spanning it should serve maritime safety above aesthetic concerns. The Navy's proposal horrified San Francisco's civic leaders. A candy-striped bridge, they argued, would look like a carnival attraction, diminishing the structure's dignity and making the city appear provincial. What they didn't say publicly was that a candy-striped Golden Gate would be impossible to photograph elegantly, limiting its potential as a tourism draw and symbol of San Francisco's sophistication. Irving Morrow, the project's consulting architect, proposed a third option: International Orange, a color specification used in the aerospace industry for high-visibility applications. International Orange, specifically a custom formulation designated as Golden Gate Bridge International Orange, exists in a precise wavelength that remains visible to human eyes in fog conditions that render most other colors invisible. The color contains a red-orange pigment that cuts through the blue-gray fog better than pure red, pure orange, or any yellow variant. But there's something unsettling about International Orange that Morrow's aesthetic explanations never quite address. It's the color of warning. It's the color painted on railroad crossing gates, on hazard cones, on life vests, and emergency equipment. It's a color that triggers a subconscious alert response in human perception. Not panic, but heightened attention, a subtle notification that caution is required. Painting the bridge required 10,000 gallons of primer and 25,000 gallons of International Orange in the initial application, enough paint to cover 10 million square feet of surface area.
This calculation accounts for the bridge's steel being painted on all sides, including surfaces that would never be directly visible but needed protection from salt air corrosion. The paint was manufactured with a lead base because lead-based paint adheres more durably to steel and resists moisture penetration more effectively than alternatives available in 1937. We now know that lead-based paint releases toxic particles as it ages and flakes. For 3 decades, microscopic lead particles fell from the Golden Gate Bridge into the bay below and into the air breathed by pedestrians and workers. The repainting operation, which continues perpetually as a rotating maintenance cycle, exposed workers to lead toxicity until 1965, when formulations were changed to reduce lead content. Medical records from bridge painters of that era show elevated blood lead levels in 73% of those tested, correlating with documented cases of cognitive impairment, kidney damage, and neurological issues. The bridge district never publicized the lead paint health consequences. When questioned in the 1970s about worker exposure, district officials stated that safety standards of the construction era were followed, without acknowledging that those standards were demonstrably inadequate. Here's what's particularly disturbing. The international orange color has become so identified with the Golden Gate Bridge that the district has trademarked the specific formulation. That means a color created to warn of danger has been transformed into a marketable brand, sold on t-shirts, coffee mugs, and tourist memorabilia. The distinction between warning and celebration has been deliberately blurred. Photographers love international orange because it creates dramatic contrast. The bridge's warm tone against cool fog, against blue sky, against the green hills of Marin County. The most iconic images of San Francisco use this color contrast to evoke beauty and engineering triumph. But if you look at those photographs as a color theorist rather than a tourist, you're seeing something different. A structure painted in the visual language of hazard, stretching across one of the most dangerous maritime passages on the Pacific coast. Was international orange a brilliant design choice that made the bridge both beautiful and functional, or a subconscious acknowledgement that what they were building was fundamentally a dangerous object requiring constant visual warning?
Leon Moisseiff designed the bridge to be graceful and flexible, but his calculations contain an error that would kill 46 people 4 years later on a different bridge. Moisseiff was the star engineer Joseph Strauss hired to legitimize the Golden Gate project. By 1929, Moisseiff had designed Manhattan Bridge, transformed the Benjamin Franklin Bridge's design, and written the definitive paper on suspension bridge deflection theory. He was the expert Strauss needed to convince skeptics that spanning the Golden Gate was mathematically possible. Moisseiff's philosophy represented a revolution in bridge engineering. He believed the suspension bridges should be light, flexible, and aerodynamic rather than heavy and rigid. His calculations showed that a slender, graceful roadway would move with wind forces instead of resisting them, dissipating energy through controlled motion rather than accumulating stress that could lead to catastrophic failure. It was elegant mathematics, and it allowed the Golden Gate to be built with less steel, at lower cost, with unprecedented aesthetic grace. The Golden Gate's roadway is only 90 feet wide, but spans 4,200 feet between towers, a ratio of 1.47 that was radical for its time. Earlier suspension bridges maintained ratios closer to 1.30, with roadways wide and rigid enough to resist lateral movement. Moisseiff's design intentionally made the Golden Gate narrower and more flexible, allowing it to sway up to 27 feet laterally in high winds and undulate vertically up to 15 feet. On May 27, 1937, opening day, winds of 45 miles per hour caused the bridge to sway noticeably. Pedestrians reported feeling the roadway move beneath their feet, like walking on a ship's deck. Some found it exhilarating, others found it terrifying. Engineers assured everyone that the movement was within design parameters. The bridge was performing exactly as Moisseiff's calculations predicted. What they didn't mention was that Moisseiff himself was uncertain. His private correspondence, discovered decades later in university archives, reveals doubts.
The Golden Gate's flexibility exceeds any previous suspension bridge. I have calculated it to be safe, but wind is the variable that humbles all engineers. We have built something that has never existed before, and we will know if I'm correct only when the wind tests it beyond our predictions. The wind tested it first on December 1, 1951. A storm with winds gusting to 69 miles per hour struck the bridge at 3 a.m. The roadway oscillated violently, swaying 27 feet horizontally and rising and falling 15 feet vertically in waves that traveled from the San Francisco end to the Marin end and back. The bridge literally rippled like a ribbon. California Highway Patrol closed the span for 4 hours. Engineers inspected every cable, every connection, and found no damage. The bridge had flexed exactly as Moisseiff designed it to. But Moisseiff wasn't alive to see his vindication. He died in 1943, 3 years after witnessing his philosophy's catastrophic failure on a different bridge, Tacoma Narrows in Washington state. Tacoma Narrows, completed in 1940, was Moisseiff's second masterpiece of flexible suspension design. Even more slender than the Golden Gate, an 8.1 ratio of width to span length, it was nicknamed Galloping Gertie because it moved constantly in even moderate winds. On November 7, 1940, in 42-mile-per-hour winds, the bridge began to oscillate with increasing amplitude. The motion shifted from vertical undulation to torsional twisting, the roadway corkscrewing along its length. At 11 a.m., the center span tore itself apart, collapsing into Puget Sound in a failure captured on film that remains the most famous footage of structural collapse in engineering history. The Tacoma Narrows collapse forced a complete reassessment of suspension bridge aerodynamics. Engineers realized that Moisseiff's calculations, while mathematically correct for static loads and vertical wind pressure, failed to account for a phenomenon called aeroelastic flutter, where wind creates oscillations that feed back into themselves, building amplitude until structural failure occurs. It's the same principle that allows a singer to shatter a wine glass by hitting its resonant frequency. Moisseiff's work on the Golden Gate predated his work on Tacoma Narrows, but both bridges embodied the same philosophy. The critical question that haunted engineers after Tacoma's failure was the Golden Gate simply lucky in its wind conditions, or was there something about its design, perhaps the difference in width, cable configuration, or orientation to prevailing winds that saved it from the same fate? Between 1953 and 1954, the Golden Gate underwent significant retrofitting. Engineers added diagonal bracing beneath the roadway, stiffening the structure against torsional motion. This modification directly responded to lessons learned from Tacoma Narrows and constituted an implicit admission that Moisseiff's original design, while functional, had operated closer to the edge of catastrophic failure than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Was Moisseiff a visionary whose flexible design philosophy succeeded with the Golden Gate and merely needed refinement, or a brilliant mathematician whose calculations missed a crucial variable that could have turned San Francisco's bridge into the same catastrophe that destroyed Tacoma?
The chief engineer died 1 year after the bridge opened, bitter and exhausted, having fought for credit on a structure he increasingly didn't understand. Joseph Strauss suffered a stroke on May 16, 1938, at his home in Los Angeles. He was 68 years old, had seen his bridge become an immediate international landmark, and had spent the final year of his life writing a book titled The Golden Gate Bridge, Report of the Chief Engineer, that emphasized his central role in every design decision and minimized the contributions of Moisseiff, Ellis, Morrow, and the dozens of other engineers whose work made the bridge possible. The stroke left Strauss partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. He died 6 days later on May 22, 1938, without completing his book or resolving the question that had consumed his final years. Would history remember him as a great engineer or as the man who happened to be in charge when great engineers did great work? The answer has been both, depending on who's writing. The statue of Strauss at the bridge's San Francisco end, installed in 1941, bears a plaque calling him the man who built the bridge.
No other names appear on that plaque. But engineering textbooks tell a different story, crediting Moisseiff with the suspension design, Ellis with the mathematical calculations, Morrow with the architectural vision, and Strauss with project management. What's undeniable is that Strauss fought longer and harder than anyone else to make the bridge happen. From 1921 to 1937, he dedicated 16 years to political battles, funding negotiations, and navigating the bureaucratic labyrinth of permits, lawsuits, and environmental objections. He testified before countless hearings, convinced skeptical bankers, and outlasted opponents who believed the bridge was technically impossible or financially irresponsible. But there's a darker thread running through Strauss's story. His obsessive need for singular credit suggests a man who knew, at some level, that his technical contributions were minimal. His design was replaced entirely by Moisseiff's. His calculations were wrong until Ellis corrected them. His aesthetic vision was overridden by Morrow's. What Strauss contributed was willpower and political cunning. Valuable traits, certainly, but not the stuff of engineering legend. The day the bridge opened, May 27, 1937, Strauss was absent from the morning's Pedestrian Day celebration. While 200,000 people walked across the span in a festival atmosphere, Strauss remained in his office, reportedly suffering from exhaustion and stress-related illness. He appeared briefly at the afternoon's vehicular opening ceremony, delivered a short speech about triumph over nature, and left before the official motorcade crossed. Photographs from that day show Strauss looking decades older than his 67 years, gaunt, hollow-eyed, moving slowly as if carrying enormous weight. Friends later reported that he seemed disappointed by the celebration, as if the public's joy somehow diminished his personal achievement rather than validated it. In the year between the bridge's opening and his death, Strauss became increasingly reclusive. He granted few interviews, declined invitations to engineering conferences, and focused on writing his account of the bridge's construction. The manuscript, found unfinished among his papers, reveals a man still fighting battles that were already decided. Entire chapters are devoted to refuting critics who questioned his engineering credentials, defending decisions that no one was still questioning, and emphasizing his role in calculations he demonstrably didn't perform. One passage stands out, never published during his lifetime. History will record that I conceived, designed, and built the Golden Gate Bridge. Let those who contributed through calculations and drawings be remembered as able assistants, but let the record show that the vision was mine alone. The record, of course, shows something more complicated. What Strauss conceived was a cantilever bridge that would have been both ugly and financially impossible. What he designed was replaced by Moisseiff's suspension concept. What he built was constructed largely by chief engineer Russell G. Cohn, while Strauss fought political battles in Sacramento and Washington, D.C. Yet, without Strauss's obsessive determination, none of it would have happened. The Golden would remain unbridged, San Francisco would be a less iconic city, and we wouldn't be examining these questions about credit and contribution. That's the paradox. Strauss was perhaps the least technically essential person on the entire project, and simultaneously the most indispensable. When he died, the San Francisco Chronicle's obituary called him Builder of the Golden Gate Bridge in the headline. The engineering journals used more precise language, Chief Engineer and Project Administrator. The difference between those descriptions is the difference between legend and truth, and with Strauss, the legend always fit uncomfortably over the truth like a suit cut for someone else. Was Strauss the visionary who made the impossible real through sheer determination, or an adequate engineer who successfully positioned himself to claim credit for others' genius while his own contributions remained primarily political?
The Golden Gate Bridge's dimensions capture both human ambition and the margin between triumph and tragedy. Each of the two main cables weighs 12,000 tons and could support 200 million pounds, equivalent to the weight of 25,000 school buses suspended in midair.
The cables are spun from 27,572 individual wires, each 0.192 inches in diameter, which means a single cable failure would require the breakage of over 27,000 separate wires simultaneously, a scenario so improbable that engineers classify it as impossible under any natural conditions. The towers rise 746 feet above the water, equivalent to a 70-story building, and sway up to 16 inches in high winds without structural stress. During construction, workers installed 1,200,000 rivets, each one requiring a 4-person team, one to heat the rivet to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, one to throw it to the installation team, one to catch it in a bucket, and one to drive it into place with a pneumatic hammer, producing 115 decibels of noise, loud enough to cause permanent hearing damage with sustained exposure. The bridge cost $35 million in 1937 dollars, equivalent to approximately $750 million in 2025 when adjusted for inflation, making it one of the most expensive infrastructure projects of the Depression era. Within the first year, 3.3 million vehicles crossed the bridge, paying tolls that generated $1.3 million in revenue against operating costs of $1.1 million, a profit margin so thin that one major earthquake, one shipping accident, or one catastrophic failure would have bankrupted the bridge district and validated every critic who called the project financially reckless. In the bridge's first month of operation, 3 people died by suicide there, establishing a pattern that has never stopped. Harold Wobber jumped on August 7, 1937, 71 days after the bridge opened. He was the first, but not by much. The second was a woman whose name doesn't appear in most records, who jumped on August 20, 1937. The third was a man identified in police reports only as John Doe No. 3, who jumped on September 3, 1937. 3 deaths in 4 weeks, when the bridge was still a novelty, still drawing celebration crowds. The bridge district's response was silence. No public statements, no discussions of safety measures, no acknowledgement that their engineering triumph had immediately become a suicide location. Internal memos from that period, later obtained through public records requests, showed district officials discussing whether publicizing the deaths would damage the bridge's reputation as a symbol of progress and optimism. They decided to say nothing and hoped the problem would resolve itself. It didn't. By the end of 1937, 10 people had died by jumping from the Golden Gate Bridge. By 1938, the annual death toll reached 13. By 1948, 100 people had died. The Brits district maintained its policy of minimal public acknowledgement, releasing statistics only when pressed by journalists and framing the suicides as unfortunate but unpreventable, like car accidents or natural deaths, just part of the bridge's operational reality. But these deaths weren't random or unpreventable. Witnesses to nearly every early suicide reported similar details. Jumpers often spent considerable time on the bridge before jumping, standing at the railing, looking out at the water. Many told bystanders what they were planning to do. In those early years, before public awareness made intervention common, passersby often did nothing, assuming the person was joking or sightseeing. The fall takes approximately 4 seconds from the bridge deck to the water 245 feet below. At impact, bodies are traveling approximately 75 miles per hour. The collision with water at that speed is equivalent to hitting concrete. The impact force is typically 15,000 pounds per square inch, enough to shatter bones, rupture organs, and cause instant unconsciousness in most cases. The few who remain conscious after impact face drowning in water that averages 54 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, cold enough that hypothermia sets in within 15 minutes. The survival rate from Golden Gate Bridge jumps is approximately 2%. Most survivors suffer severe injuries: broken ribs, punctured lungs, shattered vertebrae, compound fractures. Several survivors have reported that the moment their hands left the railing, they regretted the decision, a detail that's both tragic and haunting, because it suggests that the decision to jump is often impulsive, rather than carefully considered. Kevin Hines, who jumped in 2000 and survived, has spoken extensively about his experience. He describes the fall as simultaneously eternal and instantaneous, aware of what was happening but unable to stop it, experiencing clarity about wanting to live only after making the decision that would likely kill him. Hines hit the water feet first, fracturing his vertebrae, but surviving because, in his words, a sea lion circled beneath me and kept me afloat until the Coast Guard arrived. The sea lion detail has been questioned by some, but Coast Guard records confirm Hines was found floating face up despite severe injuries that should have made swimming impossible. The question of why the Golden Gate Bridge specifically attracts suicides has been studied extensively by psychologists and public health researchers. The conclusion is disturbing. Accessibility, iconic status, and established reputation combine to create what researchers call suicide magnetism. The bridge is easy to access, requires no planning or special equipment, and has become culturally associated with suicide to the degree that people contemplating suicide often travel significant distances specifically to jump from the Golden Gate rather than choose closer locations. In 2018, the Bridge District finally approved a $211 million suicide deterrent net, a stainless steel net extending 20 feet out from the bridge on both sides, positioned 20 feet below the roadway deck. Construction began in 2018 and was completed in early 2024. The net won't prevent people from jumping. It will catch them and prevent the 220-foot fall to the water below. Critics of the net argued that it would ruin the bridge's aesthetics, that suicidal people would simply choose other locations, that the money would be better spent on mental health services. Supporters pointed to data from other bridges, where barriers reduce suicides by over 90%, and to the fact that the Golden Gate Bridge had become the world's second most popular suicide location after the Nanjing Yangtze River Bridge in China, precisely because it lacked barriers. The net is now in place, but it doesn't address the fundamental question. What is it about this particular bridge that draws people seeking to end their lives? Was the Golden Gate Bridge's emergence as a suicide location an unforeseeable consequence of creating an accessible, iconic structure, or did its designers create something that psychologically invites people to see it as a threshold between life and death?
The Golden Gate's fog isn't weather. It's a permanent geographical feature that makes the bridge disappear for over 1,000 hours every year. San Francisco's fog forms through a process called advection fog, where warm inland air meets cold Pacific water. The California current carries frigid water from the North Pacific down the coast, keeping ocean temperatures around 54 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. When warm Central Valley air, often exceeding 90 degrees in summer, flows west toward the coast, it hits this cold ocean air and condenses instantly into fog. The Golden Gate Strait acts as a funnel, channeling this fog directly through the only major gap in the California coastal mountains for hundreds of miles. The result is a fog bank that pours through the strait like water through a breach in a dam, often reaching heights of 1,500 feet and maintaining density so thick that visibility drops to 50 feet or less. From May through October, this fog is nearly constant. Locals call it Carl the Fog, giving it a personality and agency, as if it were a conscious entity that chooses to obscure the bridge. Maritime charts mark the Golden Gate as a high-risk navigation zone due to fog conditions, and shipping accidents in the strait were common long before the bridge was built. What makes the Golden Gate's fog particularly eerie is how it interacts with the bridge itself. The International Orange Towers emerge from the fog like floating monuments disconnected from Earth, visible from above while everything below vanishes into white nothingness. From the roadway deck, drivers enter the fog layer as if passing through a curtain, visibility dropping from clear sunshine to near zero in seconds. The bridge's traffic regulations require headlights at all times, not because of darkness, but because fog can descend without warning at any hour. In thick fog, sound behaves strangely on the bridge. The fog muffles some frequencies while amplifying others, creating acoustic dead zones where car engines become silent and footsteps disappear, punctuated by sudden loud sounds that seem to come from nowhere. The bridge's foghorns, two enormous diaphragm horns mounted on the south tower and one on the north, blast at 115 decibels, audible for up to 10 miles in clear conditions. In fog, the horns sound like they're coming from inside your skull. The foghorns operate on a specific pattern, two blasts from the south, then one from the north, repeating every 20 seconds when visibility drops below 1 mile. They've sounded this pattern continuously since 1937, meaning that in fog season, May through October, they blast an average of 4,320 times per day. Residents of Sausalito and the Marina District report that the sound becomes part of the background, unconsciously noticed but consciously ignored, like living next to railroad tracks. But visitors, especially those walking the bridge in fog, describe the horns as unsettling, even frightening, a mechanical bellowing that reinforces the feeling of being suspended in nothingness. Pedestrians on the bridge during heavy fog report a distinct psychological effect: spatial disorientation and temporal distortion. Without visual reference points, the brain struggles to maintain balance and judge distance. The roadway's slight curve disappears in fog, creating the sensation of walking on an infinite straight path. Time perception distorts because fog eliminates the visual markers we unconsciously use to track progress. What should be a 40-minute walk across the bridge feels either much longer or strangely compressed. There's also the isolation factor. On clear days, the bridge is a social space. Tourists posing for photos, cyclists riding in groups, pedestrians chatting. In fog, everyone becomes solitary. People emerge from the whiteness like ghosts, pass silently and vanish again. The normal social contracts of public space, eye contact, nods, casual greetings, evaporate in fog conditions. You're alone even when surrounded by others. Psychologists studying the bridge have noted that a disproportionate number of suicides occurred during fog conditions. The data isn't definitive because fog is so common that establishing causation versus correlation is nearly impossible, but the pattern persists. Fog seems to correlate with increased jump frequency. Various theories exist. Fog provides privacy from witnesses. Fog creates emotional conditions conducive to despair. Fog eliminates the visual deterrent of seeing the water far below. But none fully explain why the correlation exists. The bridge's fog also affects its physical structure. Salt water in fog droplets corrode steel at an accelerated rate compared to dry salt air. The bridge requires continuous repainting, not just because paint fades, but because fog-driven corrosion never stops. Painters work year-round in rotating sections, meaning the bridge is never fully painted. By the time they finish one end, the other end needs repainting again. It's a task that, like the fog itself, never ends. Was the bridge built in a location where fog makes it mysterious and iconic? Or did its architects ignore the psychological effects of constructing a liminal space that disappears regularly into nothingness? During World War II, the U.S. military seriously considered destroying the Golden Gate Bridge to prevent Japanese invasion, and came within hours of issuing the demolition order. On December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the Golden Gate Bridge was 4 years old. San Francisco, the largest American city on the Pacific coast and home to critical naval facilities, immediately became the presumed next target for Japanese forces. Within 24 hours, the U.S. Army established defensive positions at both ends of the bridge, installed anti-aircraft batteries on the Marin headlands, and drew up contingency plans for what military documents labeled strategic denial operations. Strategic denial, in military terminology, means destroying your own infrastructure to prevent enemy use of it. The logic was straightforward. If Japanese forces landed in Northern California, the Golden Gate Bridge would be the fastest route for moving troops and equipment from San Francisco into Marin County and northward. A captured bridge would give invading forces immediate access to infrastructure that took 4 years to build.
A destroyed bridge would create a barrier that would take months or years to overcome. Declassified documents from the Army Corps of Engineers, released in the 1980s, reveal that demolition plans were drawn up by January 1942. Engineers calculated that destroying the bridge would require approximately 50 tons of TNT positioned at specific points on the towers and the roadway deck. The explosives would be installed, wired, and kept ready for remote detonation on a continuous basis. One officer's memo notes, "In the event of confirmed enemy landing on California coast, bridge demolition can be accomplished within 4 hours of order being given." What's particularly chilling is that these weren't theoretical plans kept in a filing cabinet. The explosives were staged, military personnel were trained on the detonation sequence, and the bridge district was informed that during wartime, military necessity superseded all civilian authority over the bridge. In effect, the Army could destroy the bridge at any time without asking permission from the people who'd built it or the citizens who owned it. The closest the order came to being issued was in June 1942, following the Japanese occupation of Attu and Kiska Islands in Alaska's Aleutian Chain. Military intelligence analysts believed this was the opening move of a northward invasion route that would eventually target the Pacific Northwest and Northern California. War Department documents show that on June 15, 1942, senior commanders discussed whether to execute bridge demolition as a preemptive measure, even without confirmed enemy landing, to eliminate the asset before it could be seized. The discussion came down to a grim calculation. Was it better to destroy American infrastructure immediately, accepting the economic and psychological cost, or wait until invasion was imminent and risk not having time to demolish it? General John L. DeWitt, commanding officer of the Western Defense Command, argued for immediate demolition. His reasoning, preserved in meeting minutes, "A bridge is steel and concrete. A bridge can be rebuilt. A city full of Japanese soldiers cannot be unbuilt." The demolition order wasn't issued, ultimately, because Navy intelligence concluded that Japan lacked the shipping capacity to mount a full-scale invasion of the continental United States. The Aleutian operations were determined to be diversionary, intended to draw American forces away from the Central Pacific. But the explosives remained in place, and the demolition orders remained active until August 1945. During those 3 years and 3 months, the Golden Gate Bridge functioned normally. Cars crossed, pedestrians walked, tolls were collected. Beneath this normalcy, demolition charges were maintained, inspected weekly, and kept ready for detonation. Citizens weren't informed. If you'd driven across the bridge in 1943, you would have no idea that military personnel were prepared to destroy it with you on it if the tactical situation required. This raises an uncomfortable question about what infrastructure means during wartime. Does a bridge belong to the people who use it daily, or to the government that may need it to deny it to an enemy? The Golden Gate Bridge was simultaneously a public utility providing essential transportation and a military asset that could be sacrificed if circumstances demanded. After the war ended, the equipment was removed, but the experience left a permanent mark on military infrastructure doctrine. Current U.S. military planning for defending against invasion includes detailed demolition protocols for every major bridge, tunnel, and transportation choke point in the country. The Golden Gate Bridge has a continuously updated demolition plan in classified military databases, ready to be executed if needed. This isn't conspiracy theory, it's acknowledged policy, though specifics remain classified. The Bridge District never publicly addressed the World War II demolition plans until forced to do so by historians in the 1990s. When asked why the public wasn't informed during or after the war, district officials stated that disclosure of military contingency operations could have caused unnecessary panic cost. Whether panic would have been unnecessary is debatable. The threat was real, the explosives were real, and the orders authorizing demolition were real. Was the military's willingness to destroy the bridge a pragmatic recognition that infrastructure is ultimately expendable in defense of a nation, or an overreaction that would have destroyed a symbol of American achievement based on invasion fears that never materialized? The bridge was engineered to survive an 8.3 magnitude earthquake on the San Andreas Fault, but the real test came in 1989 when the Loma Prieta earthquake struck the San Francisco Bay Area with a magnitude of 6.9. The epicenter was 60 miles south of San Francisco, near Santa Cruz, but seismic waves propagated throughout the region, causing 63 deaths, 3,757 injuries, and approximately $6 billion in damage. The Cypress Street Viaduct in Oakland collapsed, killing 42 people. A section of the Bay Bridge collapsed, killing 1. Buildings throughout San Francisco and the peninsula suffered severe damage. The Golden Gate Bridge, located 70 miles from the epicenter, experienced strong shaking but suffered no structural damage. No cable snapped, no towers cracked, no roadway sections collapsed. The bridge was closed for inspection for 24 hours, then reopened after engineers confirmed its structural integrity was uncompromised. District officials held press conferences declaring this a validation of the bridge's earthquake resistance, proof that Joseph Strauss and his team had designed a structure capable of withstanding the worst the San Andreas Fault could deliver. But that's not what seismologists said. The Loma Prieta earthquake occurred on the San Andreas Fault, but not on the section that poses the greatest threat to the Golden Gate Bridge. That section, the peninsula segment of the San Andreas, which runs directly beneath San Francisco, just 10 miles from the bridge, has been locked and accumulating strain since the 1906 earthquake. Seismologists estimate it's capable of producing a magnitude 7.9 earthquake, potentially larger than the 7.9 quake that destroyed San Francisco in 1906. A 7.9 earthquake is not incrementally larger than a 6.9 earthquake. It's exponentially larger. Each whole number on the Richter scale represents a 10-fold increase in ground motion amplitude and approximately 31 times more energy release. A 7.9 earthquake releases approximately 63 times more energy than the Loma Prieta quake. What seismologists noted after Loma Prieta wasn't the bridge's resilience, but its luck. The 1989 earthquake produced approximately 0.15 g of peak ground acceleration at the bridge's location, well within design parameters. But a magnitude 7.9 earthquake on the peninsula segment would produce approximately 0.7 g to 1.2 g of peak ground acceleration, depending on the precise epicenter and rupture dynamics. Those are forces an order of magnitude higher than the bridge was designed to withstand. Between 1989 and 2012, the bridge underwent a $392 million seismic retrofit, including installation of viscous dampers to absorb seismic energy, reinforced tower bases to prevent foundation failure, retrofitted connections between the roadway deck and suspension cables, enhanced lateral bracing to prevent torsional twisting. These retrofits theoretically extend the bridge's seismic survival capability to magnitude 8.0 or higher, but the theoretical part is crucial. The retrofits are based on computer modeling and scaled physical testing, techniques that have proven reliable for predicting structural behavior under known conditions. But earthquakes produce unknowable conditions. Ground motion patterns, duration of shaking, soil liquefaction effects, and resonance frequencies that can't be fully predicted until they occur. The Loma Prieta earthquake had an 8-second duration of strong shaking. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake had a 45-second duration. Duration matters enormously because structural fatigue accumulates during shaking. Connections that hold for 8 seconds may fail at 30 seconds, even at identical acceleration levels. There's also the problem of soil conditions. The Golden Gate Bridge's towers are anchored in serpentine bedrock, considered excellent for seismic stability. But the approaches at both ends, the roadway sections connecting the bridge to land, sit on fill material and sedimentary deposits that liquefy during strong earthquakes. Liquefaction doesn't threaten the bridge's main span, but it could destroy the approaches, making the bridge inaccessible even if the main structure survives intact. Geologists identify a phenomenon called earthquake clustering, where major earthquakes on one fault segment increase stress on adjacent segments, making follow-on earthquakes more likely. The Loma Prieta earthquake occurred on the southern Santa Cruz segment. Seismologists calculated it increased stress on the peninsula segment by approximately 0.5 bar, a significant increase that moves that segment closer to its failure threshold. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates there's a 72% probability of a magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquake on the San Andreas or Hayward faults in the Bay Area before 2043. The probability of a magnitude 7.5 or greater earthquake is estimated at 22%. These aren't hypotheticals, they're statistical certainties over a long enough timeline. What's particularly unsettling is that the bridge has never experienced the earthquake it was designed to survive. The Loma Prieta earthquake was a test, but not the test. The real test remains in the future. And when it comes, we'll discover whether Charles Ellis's calculations from 1930, combined with 21st century retrofit engineering, were sufficient. Here's what we know from seismic studies of other structures. Bridges designed before modern seismic codes have approximately a 40% failure rate in earthquakes exceeding their design parameters. The Golden Gate Bridge, despite retrofits, is fundamentally a 1937 design. Its steel was manufactured to 1930 specifications. Its foundations were poured with 1930s concrete formulations. Its connections were welded with 1930s techniques. Was the bridge's survival of Loma Prieta evidence that it can withstand the San Andreas Fault's full fury? Or was it evidence that the real test hasn't happened yet, and we're celebrating a trial run as if it were the final exam?
The Golden Gate Bridge operates within tolerances so precise that deviations measured in millimeters can indicate catastrophic problems developing. The main cable's tension is monitored continuously by sensors that detect changes of 0.1% or less. At 12,000 tons per cable, that's detecting force changes of 12 tons, roughly equivalent to the weight of 5 automobiles. During the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, the bridge's tower swayed approximately 8 inches horizontally, within the 16-inch design tolerance, but representing a lateral displacement that generated peak acceleration forces of 0.15 g, or about 1/7 the force of gravity pulling sideways on millions of pounds of steel. The bridge carries approximately 112,000 vehicles daily, generating traffic loads that create dynamic stress cycles engineers call fatigue loading. Each vehicle crossing causes microscopic expansion and contraction in the steel, accumulating damage over millions of cycles. After 88 years of operation, the bridge has experienced approximately 3.2 billion vehicle crossings, each one contributing infinitesimally to cumulative fatigue. The paint maintenance program requires 38 painters working continuously, consuming 5,000 to 10,000 gallons of paint annually to maintain the protective coating against corrosion caused by salt fog carrying approximately 3.5% sodium chloride. At that concentration, salt deposits accumulate at approximately 0.5 pounds per square foot per year on exposed surfaces, meaning that without continuous repainting, structural steel would lose measurable thickness to corrosion within 5 years. The bridge's retrofit cost of $392 million in 2012 dollars represents approximately 52% of the original construction cost when adjusted for inflation, suggesting that modernizing 1930s engineering to meet 21st century seismic standards essentially requires rebuilding half the bridge while traffic continues crossing the half you haven't rebuilt yet. For 38 years, one man held the job of maintaining the Golden Gate Bridge's paint, until the day the paint started maintaining him. Ken Hopper started as a bridge painter in 1952, making $2.35 per hour to hang from scaffolding 746 feet above the water, breathing paint fumes that contained lead, zinc chromate, and volatile organic compounds that would be banned decades later. He retired in 1990 at age 65, having spent 38 years doing one of the most dangerous maintenance jobs in America. Bridge painting isn't like painting a house or a barn. The Golden Gate's surface area totals approximately 10 million square feet, equivalent to painting 230 football fields laid side by side, except the football fields are vertical, swaying in 40-mile-per-hour winds, suspended above water cold enough to cause hypothermia in minutes. Painters work from scaffolding suspended by cables, enclosed in fabric to contain paint spray from drifting into the air and water below. Inside these enclosures, temperatures can reach 110 degrees Fahrenheit on sunny days, even when the air temperature outside is 60 degrees. Hopper once described the job in an interview. "You're wrapped in canvas, can't see the sky, breathing paint and solvent, feeling the bridge move under you like it's alive. After a while, you stop noticing. The bridge becomes your whole world. You forget there's ground underneath somewhere." But the lead in the paint Hopper breathed for 38 years didn't forget him. Lead accumulates in bone tissue and remains there for decades, slowly leaching back into the bloodstream throughout a person's lifetime. By the time Hopper retired, his blood lead level was measured at 47 micrograms per deciliter. The CDC considers anything above 5 micrograms per deciliter a health risk requiring medical intervention. Lead poisoning affects cognition, memory, and fine motor control. Hopper's medical records, later obtained by researchers studying occupational lead exposure, show progressive neurological decline beginning in his late 50s. By age 62, he was experiencing memory lapses significant enough that supervisors removed him from high scaffolding work due to safety concerns. By age 68, 3 years after retirement, he required full-time care due to cognitive impairment diagnosed as likely lead encephalopathy combined with age-related decline. Hopper's case wasn't unique. Of the 73 painters who worked on the Golden Gate Bridge between 1937 and 1965, when lead-based paint was phased out, medical studies tracked 52 through their retirement years. Of those 52, 41 showed blood lead levels above 40 micrograms per deciliter. Of those 41, 23 developed neurological conditions consistent with chronic lead toxicity. The numbers are devastating. Approximately 44% of long-term bridge painters developed serious cognitive impairment directly attributable to occupational lead exposure. The Bridge District knew about the lead risk by the 1950s. Internal memos discussed the lead problem and note that painters were experiencing symptoms consistent with industrial lead exposure. But the district didn't switch to lead-free paint formulations until 1965, and even then only because California enacted regulations making lead-based paint financially prohibitive due to required safety measures. What's particularly troubling is that the Bridge District never established a long-term health monitoring program for retired painters. Once a painter left employment, the district had no further contact unless the painter initiated it by filing workers' compensation claims. Most didn't file claims because proving causation between a job you left years ago and neurological problems developing decades later is legally difficult and expensive. Hopper died in 2004 at age 79. His death certificate lists cardiovascular failure as cause of death, with chronic lead exposure listed as a contributing factor. His widow attempted to file a wrongful death suit against the Bridge District, arguing that Hopper's premature cognitive decline and health problems stemmed directly from lead exposure the district knew was dangerous. The case was settled out of court for an undisclosed sum, with a confidentiality agreement preventing the widow from discussing specifics. But here's what makes Hopper's story particularly haunting.
In his final years, when dementia had progressed significantly, he would sometimes tell his caretakers that he needed to get to work on the bridge. He'd describe specific sections that needed painting, recall the names of long-dead colleagues, explain the proper technique for applying primer coat in fog conditions. The bridge, which he'd painted continuously for 38 years, had imprinted itself so deeply in his neural pathways that even as those pathways deteriorated, the bridge remained. His daughter later said, "At the end, he couldn't remember my name or recognize my face, but he could tell you exactly how to paint the North Tower's east face, which primer to use, how many coats, how long to wait between applications. The bridge was the last thing he remembered, and I think it's because the bridge never left his body. The lead in his bones kept the bridge alive inside him." Modern bridge painting uses lead-free paint formulations, enclosed scaffolding with filtered air supply, and strict exposure limits. Painters wear respirators, undergo regular blood testing, and work shortened shifts to minimize exposure to volatile organic compounds. These measures have reduced occupational health risks dramatically, but they can't help the painters like Ken Hopper, who absorbed decades of lead before anyone acknowledged the problem or implemented protections. Was Ken Hopper a dedicated worker who made the unfortunate mistake of working before safety standards caught up with industrial hazards? Or was he a sacrifice to the bridge's maintenance, a man whose body and mind were consumed by the structure he spent his life preserving? Between 1960 and 1995, a woman walked the bridge every single day and kept a journal of every jumper she witnessed, creating a document that bridge officials tried to suppress. Charlotte Keller crossed the Golden Gate Bridge on foot every morning for 35 years, walking from San Francisco to Sausalito and back as her daily exercise routine. What started as fitness became obsession. Keller began documenting every suicide attempt she witnessed, every successful jump, every near miss prevented by intervention. Her journals, later donated to the University of California Archives, contain 412 entries describing bridge deaths in methodical detail. Entry 127, dated July 3, 1974. Young man, approximately 25, climbed the east railing at approximately 10:15 a.m., stood on the outer edge for 6 minutes. 3 pedestrians walked past without stopping. I approached and asked if he needed help. He said, "It's too late." He jumped before I could reach him. Coast Guard recovered the body approximately 90 minutes later. Entry 284, dated September 19, 1986. Woman, approximately 40, sat on the railing near the North Tower, 8:30 a.m. CHP officer arrived within 3 minutes. Someone must have called. Officer talked to her for 22 minutes. I watched from 50 feet away. She was crying. The officer was doing most of the talking. Eventually, she climbed back over the railing and walked away with the officer. Later, I wondered if she's still alive, or if she came back on a day when no one was watching. Entry 391, dated May 12, 1993. Man, elderly, walked to the center span carrying nothing. 7:15 a.m. Very few people on the bridge. He climbed the railing quickly, no hesitation. I shouted and started running toward him. He looked at me, waved, and jumped. By the time I reached the spot, there was nothing to see. The water looked exactly the same as it had before. That's what stays with me, how the water doesn't change. Keller's journals reveal patterns that bridge officials and suicide prevention researchers had claimed didn't exist. She documented that 73% of the jumps she witnessed occurred during fog conditions, when visibility was less than 100 feet. She noted that 68% of jumpers spent more than 5 minutes at the railing before jumping, suggesting that rapid intervention might prevent many deaths. She recorded that in 89 instances, other pedestrians passed within 20 feet of someone clearly preparing to jump without stopping or asking if they needed help. Most disturbingly, Keller documented 23 cases where California Highway Patrol officers or bridge security personnel were present but arrived too late to intervene. Too late meaning they arrived while the person was still on the bridge, but after the person had already climbed over the railing, creating a situation where approaching might cause the person to jump immediately rather than engage in conversation. In 1995, Keller contacted the Golden Gate Bridge Highway and Transportation District, offering her journals as primary source material for understanding suicide patterns. The district declined. According to correspondence preserved in her papers, a district spokesperson stated that anecdotal observations by a private citizen, however well-intentioned, do not constitute research data useful for policy formation. Keller persisted, contacting suicide prevention organizations, public health researchers, and local media. Her journals eventually reached Dr. Richard Seiden at UC Berkeley School of Public Health, who was conducting the first comprehensive study of Golden Gate Bridge suicides. Seiden's research, published in 1978, relied partly on Keller's data, though he couldn't cite her journals directly as they weren't official records. The Bridge District's resistance to acknowledging Keller's documentation appears to have been motivated by liability concerns. Internal memos from the 1980s, obtained through public records requests, show district attorneys expressing concern that acknowledging extensive anecdotal evidence of suicides could establish constructive knowledge of the bridge's danger, potentially exposing the district to wrongful death lawsuits from families of suicide victims. In other words, the district's position was that officially not knowing about the suicides in detail provided legal protection, whereas officially acknowledging documentation like Keller's journals could be used as evidence that the district knew the bridge was dangerous and failed to install barriers or implement adequate prevention measures. Keller died in 1997 at age 79. Her journals, donated to the UC Berkeley archives by her family, remain the most detailed first-hand account of Golden Gate Bridge suicides ever compiled. Researchers studying suicide prevention still reference her observations, particularly her documentation of the hesitation period most jumpers experience, time during which intervention could potentially prevent death. What makes Keller's story particularly significant is what it reveals about institutional priorities. The Bridge District's primary concern during the decades when Keller was documenting deaths was protecting the bridge's reputation and limiting liability exposure. The possibility that her detailed observations might help prevent future deaths was secondary to concerns about legal risk and public perception. Keller's final journal entry, dated November 8, 1995, 3 months before she stopped her daily walks due to declining health. Today was the 412th death I've witnessed from this bridge. I don't know why I continue to count. The numbers don't make anyone care more. I used to think that if I documented everything carefully enough, that someone would have to pay attention. Someone would have to do something. Now I think I continue because someone should remember these people, even if I never knew their names. Was Charlotte Keller a dedicated citizen who documented an ongoing tragedy in hope of prompting change? Or an obsessive litmus whose 35 years of documentation prove that no amount of evidence compels institutions to act when action threatens their interests? The suicide deterrent net, finally installed in 2024, could have been built in 1937, but wasn't. And the reasons why reveal what structures really protect. On January 11, 2024, the Golden Gate Bridge suicide deterrent net became fully operational. The system consists of stainless steel netting extending 20 feet horizontally from both sides of the bridge, positioned 20 feet below the roadway deck. Anyone jumping from the bridge lands in the net rather than continuing to the water 220 feet below. The net covers 1.7 miles of the bridge, cost $211 million to design and install, and took 6 years to construct. The net could have been built in 1937. The technology existed. The engineering was straightforward, far simpler than the suspension bridge itself. But it wasn't built in 1937, or in 1947, or 1967, or 1987. It was built 87 years after the bridge opened, after approximately 2,000 confirmed suicides and an estimated 500 additional unconfirmed deaths. Why did it take 87 years to install a barrier that everyone agreed would prevent deaths? The answer isn't technical. It's a case study in how institutions prioritize aesthetics, economics, and reputation over human lives, then construct elaborate justifications for those priorities. The first proposal for suicide barriers came in 1953, 16 years after the bridge opened and after 164 documented suicides. A group of local psychiatrists approached the bridge district with a plan. Install a vertical barrier, either chain-link fencing or plexiglass panels, along the entire length of the pedestrian walkways. Cost estimate? $850,000. The district board rejected the proposal, stating in meeting minutes that the bridge is a symbol of beauty and engineering excellence, and modifications that diminish its aesthetic appeal would be inappropriate. Translation: we value how the bridge looks more than we value preventing deaths. The second proposal came in 1970, after 515 documented suicides. Marin County Supervisor Peter Aragoni proposed a suicide barrier consisting of angled steel bars extending upward from the existing railing, designed to prevent anyone from climbing over. Cost estimate? $3.2 million. The district board again rejected it, this time citing concerns that creating a perception of the bridge as a suicide location could harm tourism and diminish its status as a national landmark. Translation: acknowledging the problem might hurt our brand. The third proposal came in 1995, after 1,128 documented suicides. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention presented research showing that barriers on other bridges, including the Ellington Bridge in Washington, D.C., and the Grafton Bridge in Auckland, England, had reduced suicides by over 90%. Cost estimate? $15 million. The district board commissioned a study, which took 4 years, and concluded that barriers were feasible and would likely be effective. The board then rejected implementation, stating that the bridge district's primary responsibility is maintaining the bridge as critical transportation infrastructure, and aesthetics are integral to that responsibility. Translation: we have competing priorities, and preventing suicides ranks below maintaining visual appeal. Throughout this 70-year period, bridge district officials consistently made two arguments against barriers. Suicidal people will simply choose another location. This argument has been thoroughly debunked by research. Studies show that suicide is often an impulsive act, and when a specific method becomes unavailable, most people don't seek alternatives. They don't die by suicide at all. The myth of suicide displacement persists not because evidence supports it, but because it's emotionally comfortable to believe that nothing could have prevented these deaths. Barriers will ruin the bridge's aesthetic integrity. This argument reveals what institutions actually value. The bridge's aesthetic integrity means the unobstructed view from the pedestrian walkway, the ability to look straight down to the water, to lean over the railing and feel the height, to take photos without chain link or plexiglass in the frame. These are real aesthetic values, but placing them above human life requires believing that beauty is more important than preventing death. What finally changed? Not the arguments or the evidence, both had been consistent for decades. What changed was liability exposure. In the 2000s, families of suicide victims began filing wrongful death lawsuits against the bridge district, arguing that by failing to install barriers despite decades of knowledge about the suicide problem, the district was negligent. Several of these suits were settled out of court with confidential settlement terms, but the legal pressure made inaction increasingly expensive. In 2008, the district board finally approved a suicide deterrent project. It took 6 more years to select a design. Why so long? Because the design selection process prioritized aesthetic impact over effectiveness. The horizontal net design was chosen over vertical barriers specifically because nets are less visible from the roadway and don't obstruct views. In other words, even when finally committing to suicide prevention, the district ensured that aesthetics remained the priority. Construction began in 2018 and finished in 2024. During those 6 years of construction, an additional 212 people died by jumping from the bridge, an average of 35 people per year, which represents an increase from the historical average of approximately 23 per year. Some suicide prevention researchers have suggested that the publicity around net construction may have created a deadline effect, where suicidal individuals rushed to jump before the net was completed, though proving causation is impossible. The net is now in place. Early data from 2024 shows 0 successful suicides from the bridge. People jump, land in the net, and are rescued by bridge security personnel who rappel down to extract them. Every rescue represents a life saved, and most people rescued from the net report feeling immediate regret about jumping. But here's the calculation that should haunt anyone examining this data. If the net had been installed in 1960, when the technology existed and the problem was already clear, approximately 1,800 people who died would still be alive. If installed in 1980, approximately 1,200 people would still be alive. If installed in 2000, approximately 600 people would still be alive. Each of those people had families, friends, unrealized potential, futures that never happened, and all of them died during a period when the Bridge District had the means, knowledge, and resources to prevent their deaths, because preventing their deaths would have required compromising the bridge's appearance. Was the 86-year delay in installing the suicide net an understandable result of competing priorities and complex decision-making, or was it a systematic prioritization of aesthetics over human life that makes the Bridge District complicit in preventable deaths? The human cost of the Golden Gate Bridge's existence can be quantified in numbers that defy moral comprehension. Between 1937 and 2024, before the suicide net was installed, approximately 2,000 confirmed suicides occurred from the bridge, averaging one death every 16 days for 87 years. This makes it the second most used suicide location on Earth, after only the Nanjing Yangtze River Bridge in China. Studies of bridge suicide survivors show that approximately 95% report immediate regret after jumping, a detail suggesting that most of the 2,000 deaths represented impulsive decisions that might have been prevented by barriers, intervention, or even a momentary delay. The 2% survival rate means that 40 people survived the 245-foot fall to water, though most sustained life-altering injuries, including shattered vertebrae, ruptured organs, and compound fractures requiring years of reconstructive surgery. The economic cost of not installing barriers earlier can be calculated using the EPA's Standard Value of Statistical Life figure of $9.6 million, 2023 dollars. 2,000 deaths times $9.6 million equals $19.2 billion in lost societal value, compared to the $211 million actual cost of the suicide net, a ratio of 91.1, meaning society lost $91 in human value for every dollar saved by delaying barrier installation. The psychological toll on witnesses who saw jumpers is unquantified but real. An estimated 20,000 people have directly witnessed someone jumping from the bridge over its operational life, creating a population of traumatized witnesses larger than the population of many small cities, each carrying memories of watching someone die in a decision that took 4 seconds to complete and cannot be undone. The Golden Gate Bridge has outlived every person who designed, built, and opened it, and continues consuming those who maintain it in ways that suggest infrastructure has no memory, only appetite. The last worker from the original construction crew died in 2012. His name was Al Zampa, and he was 95 years old. Zampa had been one of the Halfway to Hell Club members, men who fell into the safety net and survived. He spent his final years telling stories about building the bridge, about the 10 men who died when the net failed, about the smell of hot rivets and the sound of wind through incomplete cables. Near the end of his life, Zampa told an interviewer something strange. "The bridge is still being built. It's never finished. Every time I drive across, I see them up there. Painters, inspectors, workers replacing rivets or cables or sections of roadway. The bridge is permanent, but it requires constant human effort to remain permanent. In that way, it's still consuming workers, still demanding sacrifices, just slower than it did during construction." Zampa's observation is mathematically accurate. The bridge requires 38 full-time painters, 17 ironworkers, 13 engineers, and approximately 200 additional personnel working in maintenance, inspection, toll collection, and administration. That's 268 people whose professional lives are devoted entirely to the bridge's continued existence. Over the bridge's 87-year operational life, approximately 12,000 people have been employed in bridge maintenance, far more than the 1,100 workers who built it originally. The death toll from maintenance work is lower than from construction, but not zero. Since 1937, 11 maintenance workers have died in falls, accidents, or exposure-related incidents while working on the bridge. This equals the construction death toll, meaning the bridge has killed the same number of people maintaining it as it did building it, and maintenance continues indefinitely while construction was finite. There's also the toll that doesn't show up in death statistics: occupational injuries, chronic health conditions, and psychological effects of working at extreme heights in dangerous conditions. Bridge iron workers have injury rates 300% higher than general construction workers, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics data. The most common injuries are falls from scaffolding, usually non-fatal, but causing fractures, spinal injuries, and traumatic brain injuries. Repetitive stress injuries from working with heavy tools in awkward positions, and respiratory damage from exposure to paint solvents, metal particles, and salt air. A 2019 study of Golden Gate Bridge maintenance workers found that 41% reported chronic joint pain, 33% reported hearing loss from prolonged exposure to wind noise and pneumatic tools, and 18% reported symptoms consistent with occupational asthma. These are conditions that develop gradually over years of exposure, not dramatic or immediately attributable to the bridge, but cumulative effects that reduce quality of life and shorten life expectancy. The bridge also consumes in less obvious ways. Toll collectors, before automation replaced most of them, worked in small booths suspended over the roadway, breathing exhaust fumes of 112,000 vehicles daily. Studies of toll collectors from the 1970s through 1990s show elevated rates of respiratory illness, cardiovascular disease, and cancer consistent with chronic exposure to vehicle emissions. No one thought of toll collectors as bridge sacrifices, but their bodies absorb the accumulated pollutants of millions of cars crossing, and those pollutants had effects. Then there are the maintenance workers who don't die, but disappear in other ways. Bridge painting, ironwork, and high-elevation maintenance attracts a specific personality type. People comfortable with danger, often dealing with personal demons, sometimes running from something. The Bridge District's HR records, accessed through public records requests, show that maintenance worker turnover averages 35% annually, far higher than typical construction trades. Exit interviews cite job stress, psychological toll of working at height, and personal reasons without elaboration. One former painter, speaking anonymously to a researcher in 2015, said, "You spend your days suspended over water, knowing that one mistake, one moment of inattention means you're gone. Some guys can't handle that, they quit. But some guys start to feel like the bridge wants them up there." I know that sounds crazy, but when you're alone in a paint enclosure 700 feet up and the wind is making the scaffold sway and you can hear the cables humming, it's like the bridge is breathing around you. After a while, you start to wonder if the bridge is alive, and if it's alive, whether it has intentions. This kind of testimony gets dismissed as worker superstition, but it reveals something important about the psychological effect of maintaining a structure that demands constant human attention, yet will outlast every human who attends to it. The bridge will be here in 2100, will likely be here in 2200, might be here in 2500. The workers keeping it functional won't be. From the bridge's perspective, if we imagine it having one, humans are temporary replaceable maintenance units that arrive, work, and are replaced by other maintenance units. The Bridge District projects that the Golden Gate Bridge will require continuous operation and maintenance for at least another 150 years, possibly longer with ongoing structural retrofits. That means generations of workers not yet born will spend their careers maintaining a structure built by people 3 or 4 generations dead. The bridge connects more than San Francisco to Marin County. It connects the dead to the unborn through a chain of workers whose labor makes permanence possible. Is this consumption, this endless requirement of human effort to maintain something that outlives its maintainers, simply the nature of infrastructure? Or is there something specifically hungry about the Golden Gate Bridge that has made it the world's second deadliest suicide location, a structure that has killed 11 during construction, 11 more during maintenance, consumed decades of Ken Hopper's brain function through lead poisoning, and required 2,000 deaths before its aesthetics could be compromised enough to install a suicide barrier? The bridge stands today essentially as it was in 1937. Orange cables suspended between towers that pierce fog like warnings, a roadway that sways in winds and has killed more people by suicide than any act of war or natural disaster ever affected its structure. Joseph Strauss is gone, Charles Ellis is gone, Leon Moisseiff is gone, every worker who built it is gone. Charlotte Keller and her journals are gone, the 2,000 who jumped are gone. But the bridge remains, requiring painting, inspection, maintenance, and human attention every single day. A monument that has transformed from an engineering achievement into something else, something that doesn't end, something that consumes and endures and waits beneath fog for the next worker to climb its towers, the next pedestrian to walk its span, the next person to stand at the railing and look down at water that remains always 220 feet below and exactly 4 seconds away.